I'd like to now stop talking and introduce you all to Nubia Pena. Nubia is the director of the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs and has been working as a community organizer, advocate, and ally for marginalized populations for the past 15 years. Nubia was also recently named as one of Utah Business Magazine's 2020 40 Under 40 award recipients, which sounds so cool. So Nubia, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you have the opportunity to share yours and hand this over to you. Thank you so much for being here, Nubia.
Thank you so very much, and I appreciate you giving me access. I will go ahead and share my screen at this point. Can everyone see that okay?
Great.
We got thumbs up. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. So to Tori and Ashley and also to Jen, I just really appreciate the fact that I was invited to be one of your session facilitators during our 2020 virtual NSET conference. It is such a pleasure. I also want to acknowledge the staff and everyone that put a lot of effort in coordinating this. Having a virtual event is a lot of moving parts, and I want to specifically thank Ashley and Tori for the grace and compassion they gave me as we navigated Zoom logistics. So thank you again. And to our audience, I want to definitely say thank you for selecting this session and being with us today, for your willingness to continue to show up in spaces where you get to build your capacity to better serve the survivors in our communities and across the nation. So thank you. Today, we are going to be talking about social justice as our prevention framework, building civically engaged leaders. But before we dive in too much, I really want to just acknowledge that it has been a bit of a new normal that we've had to navigate. And so I've asked that Tori please launch a poll. And the first question that we have for you today will be, have you mastered, let's try that again. Have you mastered your new normal of online engagement? We have yes, somewhat, no, nowhere near it, and finally, what is normal? I can't recall that feeling. So please feel free to participate. We've got lots of answers coming through. Thank you again for engaging. We've got a lot of somewhats. We've got a lot of what is normal. I definitely can relate to that. I can't recall that feeling. Okay, let's see. Couple more coming through. Somewhat seems to be the one that's winning. I appreciate again the participation. All right, so it seems that we are still navigating and figuring it out. I will tell you that I'm definitely on that same plane with you. And this was, let's go ahead and close that up. This was a meme that I thought really accurately reflected how I was struggling the first few weeks of the moving to a remote platform. And so as you can see today, I am prepared, I'm engaged, and I'm present. But Zoom etiquette has been fascinating. And with Zoom etiquette, I do want to note that I have had some bandwidth issues and a couple of hiccups have happened already this morning. And so I will be turning off my camera to make sure that there's no delays. So please just know that I will be looking at the chat and looking at the content that's being shared. But if you don't see me, that's the reason why. Okay, so I wanted to just make sure that that was communicated so that our conference facilitators didn't panic that I wasn't on screen. Okay.
Nubia, before you get to your next poll, just a quick note. The interpreters, if we could also just try to slow down our speech. I know that's very hard for me, but just a note so they can keep up with us.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate the reminder. I will very much try my very best to slow down. So thank you so much for that reminder. And again, you just have to poke me because once I get really passionate about things, I tend to go faster. So I will be mindful, but thank you. So as Tori and Ashley mentioned in the beginning, we wanted to know a little bit about who is in the virtual room, right? So who's with us today? And we noticed that there were several people across the state. I am currently in Philadelphia, so I live in Utah, but I'm in Philadelphia taking care of my mom, who is a beautiful, bold, and brilliant survivor of cancer. And so lots of prayers for mom. I would welcome them, and happy wishes and recovery thoughts. But gratefully, I am representing 2 locations. And again, I just am curious to see who else we have in the room with us. So we have Texas, we have Garden State, we have the Bahamas, slightly jealous. San Diego, Hawaii, California. Definitely, we've got some people representing Cali again. We've got Wyoming, Wisconsin. All right, lots of people from across the nation. So I want to, again, welcome you and say thank you for joining us. Now, I want to share that I was thrilled when I was invited to speak on what I have come to believe is one of the most significant dialogues that our nation faces, and it critically intersects with our work in the anti-violence and sexual assault prevention movement. So today, our focus will be on the critical need for us to incorporate social justice in our prevention efforts to build civically engaged leaders, specifically amongst our youth. But I do want to be transparent that the original language that I provided in my workshop proposal and is the basis for our presentation today has shifted slightly due to the current events. I would hope that many of you would agree that so much has happened these past few months that we really need to make sure that our conversation is relevant and that we're being mindful of how George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jake Blake, the devastating impacts of the pandemic, specifically on communities of color, and the attack on democracy that is oppressing the ability for all persons to be civically engaged. We have to be able to talk about that and make space, whatever part of our movement we're in, whether it's in prevention, whether it's in administration, whether it's in policy, there has to be an acknowledgement. So just as we have needed to shift our way of engaging the world and navigating our work and worship spaces, we also have to reconsider the way that we teach violence prevention. So our nation is undergoing a racial reckoning, and we must be actively building our own capacity to engage in a historic movement towards change, towards reform, and towards transformative justice. That means diving deeply into our own learning and growing our foundational knowledge about social and racial justice and what equity will look like when all people have a right to access, a right to freedom, and liberty from systemic oppression. We must engage our youth, our children, our elders, and every generation to individually and collectively stand in solidarity on the front lines as we step in, step up, and step out on efforts that demand justice. We must also continue to explore conversations about violence prevention through a lens where dismantling oppressive institutions that disproportionately target and systematically minorize populations is part of our mission and priorities at our coalitions and organizations. Because anti-oppression is not and should not be a side note, an extra project, nor should it be reserved to a 1-hour time block during our 40-hour training. Anti-oppression work is prevention work because oppression interrupts the capacity for people to be in control of their sexual, mental, emotional, financial, socio-political, relational, and spiritual health. Oppression is the root cause, and if we want to eradicate sexual violence, we must also seek to eradicate the chains that keep communities from achieving full liberation. But in order to do that, we have to continue to move beyond conversations that consider individual behavior and instead boldly challenge the long-standing policies that have deeply benefited from the silencing and disenfranchisement of historically marginalized groups. Social justice as a prevention framework can help us increase the capacity to build up civically engaged leaders to resist the status quo and learn to envision a world where power is shared, resources are equitably accessible, where race, color, gender, or non-gender, orientation, and ability does not predict the level of success or failure that one will experience. So what you can expect from our conversation today is that we will consider if social justice can apply to RPE. We will create shared language when considering how to define this nuanced term. We will also discuss why intersections matter. We will also briefly cover how critical consciousness can lead to civic engagement. There will be some time spent briefly reviewing practical examples from theory to practice. So learning from our past to help guide our future initiatives, and current social justice programming that is highlighted by Stop SB and other examples of social justice efforts that are ongoing across our nation. So the lawyer in me requires that I do provide a few disclaimers in all of my presentations so that I really can prepare you for what we're about to do and also avoid any and all liability for what I'm about to say. So the 3 brief disclaimers that I'd like to provide include that this session can be incredibly difficult. I will be addressing systemic, historic, and institutional racism and oppression. I will show a few videos and images during this training that will be challenging, painful, and it can also trigger. I will make sure that I provide a warning before I show them so that you can make sure you gauge your body, your soul, and consider if you're in a place to consume this. But I also wanted to make sure you knew that it is okay if you're not. I want to make sure that we extend as much grace and compassion through this session because many of us are coming into the space with our emotions raw from what we have survived these past few months. I also want to note that the images and videos are not meant to be used as what has been coined in the movement as trauma porn. That is where content is shared for the sake of shock value or emotional gratification without moving towards actual change. This session is specifically meant to inspire us to use the stories of our past and present to disrupt the complacency that we experience with traditional forms of prevention, education, and reimagine violence prevention by infusing it with justice efforts so we can effectively place a call to action to everyone, but specifically for our youth so that they get involved. Whew. Okay, so the second disclaimer is that I tend to ask for a lot of audience participation. So if I say, how did that make you feel? I invite you to write your answer in the chat and feel free to respond to your peers' comments. This is as much for you as it is for me so that you remain present and engaged. The final disclaimer is that I am from Philly, as I had already mentioned, and I do tend to speak incredibly fast. I promise you that I will be really mindful of that, and I will try to take as many breaths as possible in between sentences. But I also just want to know that I'm essentially creating a 1.5 hour presentation from an 8-hour training that I do. And I really want to make this session count by giving you as much information that could potentially ignite interest for you to begin this work within your respective communities. But please know that this is only one part of the conversation, right? Like there's so much more that we need to be unpacking. And we all need to do our own relearning and debiasing so that we can create more inclusive spaces in our movement. So please remember that there will be other topics to consider. How does implicit bias show up in our service delivery? How do stereotypes, how does our privilege in some ways influence the way that we consider the programming that we prioritize? So all of that will need to continue well after this session is concluded. So again, the disclaimers and reminders is that it is painful, it is uncomfortable, but it is necessary and it is critical, because if it doesn't challenge you, then it won't change you. And what we are here to do is make those bold moves and change systems to be able to create more equitable and just societies. So the final request that I have is, again, to focus. Many of us right now have our videos off, so we could be doing a plethora of things in the background. But within an hour and a half that we have together, I'm asking that we remain engaged. I'm asking that you are able for just a moment to tune the rest of the world out and to stay in this space with one another so that we can take as much time as possible to consume the content and reframe the way that we consider doing prevention education. So if at all possible, I would ask that in your chat, you please type in, I am present. If you can please type in, I am present. I see a lot of I am presence. Thank you, I am present. Thank you, thank you, thank you, leaders. Thank you, family. Thank you. And with that, I will say that I am present with you as well. Thank you. All right. So what I want us to now do is to start us off is do a brief gap analysis to see where we stand on social justice within our movement. So I have 3 questions that I will ask you to answer. The first is it our role to teach about social justice in rape prevention education? And your 3 options will be yes, no, or unsure. The next poll will be, is it our role to teach about civic engagement? Yes, no, or unsure. And then the final question will be, do you feel equipped to teach about these topics? So I will ask that Tori launch the poll, which is now open. Excellent. I really appreciate the level of engagement. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I also appreciate that we have several who have said, yes, it's our role. Yes, it's our role to teach about both civic engagement and social justice. But I also appreciate the truth and honesty of individuals who may have answered in saying that no, it might not be our role, or that maybe they're unsure, and maybe this session will be able to help us reach that perspective. Excellent, thank you. And then what I appreciate as well is the third question is, do you feel equipped to teach about these topics? And we had, it was pretty much split with yes, no, and unsure, sharing similar amount of individuals saying that, you know, either they felt equipped, but 106 participants felt unsure. So my hope is that by the time that we are done with this session, you will have additional skills to translate into your work. And if not, then make sure that you follow up with me afterwards, and we can continue to unpack. Okay, excellent. Stop sharing that. Excellent, thank you. All right, so what I want us to do to consider and really think about this question of, you know, social justice. Is it our role? Does it have a place in our work? I'm going to show you a video. It's about 10 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to consider, what did you think when you saw the content? What did you feel? Could you relate? And does this apply to rape prevention education programming? Now, I show a lot of videos during my full day sessions, and this is one of them, and it's called Social Justice in Schools. And I'll provide a gentle warning that the presenter shows an image of a historic incident that occurred in South Africa during apartheid, and that can be incredibly difficult to see. So I do ask that you be aware of that as you consume the content. Once again, consider the following questions. What did you think? What did you feel? Could you relate? And does this apply to our PE program?
Nubia, we are unable to hear the video.
Controversial.
Oh, and let's pause that for a moment. So we did try this yesterday.
Nubia, I think you need to keep yourself unmuted while the video is playing.
Zoom. You always learn something new. All right, let's try this again. Can you hear that okay?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Social justice. What do you think of? To me, social justice is a simple concept. It's the notion that all people in a society deserve fair and equitable rights, opportunities, and access to resources. But it's become controversial and nebulous because we've stopped talking about what working for social justice actually looks like. Working for social justice can look like this, or this. It can look like this, or it can look like this, or my favorite, it can look like that. Those are my students. And whenever I'm asked to articulate my work or my priorities as a teacher, I explain that I believe education can be a tool for social justice. But a few months ago, I logged onto Twitter, as I do, and I saw that a fellow teacher had taken issue with that belief. Teachers, he said, should not be social justice warriors because the purpose of education is to educate. And he ended his argument by saying, I teach my subject. But I reject that simplification because teachers don't just teach subjects, we teach people. When our students walk into our classrooms, they bring their identities with them. Everything they experience in our rooms is bound up in historical context. And so if we insist that education happens in a vacuum, we do our students a disservice. We teach them that education doesn't really matter because it's not relevant to what's happening all around them. And what's happening all around them? Well, racism, for one. In 2016, the University of Chicago released a report that revealed that according to results of the implicit association test, fully 88% of white people harbored subconscious biases against Black people, believing them to be less intelligent, lazier, and more dangerous than whites. And that's just one concrete example of the insidious effects of historic and systemic racism on our country. For more evidence, we could look at incarceration rates. We could look at statistics on police violence against Black people. We could look at the opportunity gap in education. So yeah, social justice belongs in our schools. Social justice should be a part of the mission of every school and every teacher in America if we want liberty and justice for all to be more than a slogan. Because schools are crucial places for children to become active citizens and to learn the skills and the tools that they need to change the world. So what are those skills? Okay, here's a secret. Many of the skills that people need to orchestrate the kinds of change that will lead to justice are already built into the work of schools. Things like problem solving, critical thinking, collaboration, perseverance, none of that should be revolutionary on its own. Combine that with the ability to understand history, not as one static and objective narrative on which we all agree, but as a series of intertwined events about which there can be countless interpretations. If we deliberately choose to explore history with our students rather than just teach it, we help them understand that history is ongoing and that it's connected to current movements for justice. And we help them see themselves as potential players within a living history. So those are the skills I'm talking about when I say that education can be a place to help kids learn how to work for justice. But maybe the reason that my Twitter critic wasn't happy with that idea is because he doesn't agree with my definition of justice. Fair enough. Maybe he and I don't see eye to eye politically. But here's the thing. Our aim is to encourage students to articulate their own opinions, not to coerce them into agreeing with us. So it actually doesn't matter if he and I agree. What matters is that we're helping students have those conversations with each other. And that means that as adults, we need to learn how to become effective facilitators of our students' activism. We've got to help them learn how to have really tricky conversations. We have to expose them to different opinions. And we have to help them see how what they're learning in school connects to the world outside. So here's an example of that. Every year, my students study the history of apartheid in South Africa as a case study of injustice. Now, for those of you who don't know, apartheid was a brutally racist system, and the white-ruled government in South Africa imposed racist laws to oppress people of color. And if you resisted those laws, you risked jail time, violence, or death. And around the country, around the world, other countries' governments, including ours in the United States, hesitated to sanction South Africa because, well, we benefited from its resources. So in 1976, the South African government passed a new law, which required that all students in South Africa learn in the language Afrikaans, which was a white language. And many Black South Africans referred to that language as the language of the oppressor. So not surprisingly, students of color were outraged at this law. They already attended segregated schools with overcrowded classrooms, a lack of resources, and a frankly racist curriculum. And now they were being told to learn in a language neither they nor their teachers spoke. So on the morning of June 16th, 1976, thousands of kids from the township of Soweto walked out of schools, and they marched peacefully through the streets to protest the law. At an intersection, they met up with the police, and when the kids refused to turn back, the police officers set dogs on them, and then they opened fire. The Soweto Uprising ended in tragedy. Apartheid itself didn't end until almost 20 years later. But the activism of those kids in Soweto profoundly changed the way the world viewed what was happening in South Africa. News outlets all around the world published this photo of 13-year-old Hector Peterson, who was one of the first people killed by police in Soweto. And it became nearly impossible to ignore the brutality of the apartheid regime. In the months and the years that followed the Soweto Uprising, more and more countries exerted political and economic pressure on the South African government to end apartheid. And it was largely due to the activism of those kids in Soweto. So every year my kids learn about this. And invariably, they start to draw connections between those kids in Soweto and themselves. And they start to ask themselves what kind of political power and agency they have. They ask themselves whether there would ever be a reason they would risk their lives so that a future generation could live in a more just world. And most profoundly for me, every single year they ask themselves whether adults will ever listen to their voices. A few years ago, my principal got an anonymous email from one of our students. It informed him that the following day, the students planned to walk out of school. This was in the wake of Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, Missouri, and the students were planning to join a walkout and march in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. So at this point, the staff at the school had a decision to make. Would we use our authority and our power to try to control the students and prevent them from leaving? Or would we support them as they put into practice the principles of social justice that we had taught them about since their 9th grade year? So the next morning, the kids left school en masse and they gathered on the lawn. And one of the seniors jumped up on a picnic table and went over safety expectations. And the younger kids took it very seriously. And as teachers and as staff, we told them, okay, be safe, and we watched as they marched off. The kids who chose to stay spent that afternoon in class. They debated the merits of protest. They talked about the history of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they went on with classes as scheduled. And those who chose to leave participated in a citywide student walkout and raised their collective voice for justice. But no matter where they chose to spend the afternoon, our kids learned valuable lessons that day. They learned that the adults in their lives would support them, even as we worried for their safety. And they learned that they didn't need us to tell them how or when or even why to protest. They learned that they were members of a community of young people with a shared vision of a more equitable society. And they learned that they had power within that society. They learned that events like the Soweto Uprising are not ancient history, and they don't have to end in tragedy. And that's what education as a tool for social justice can look like. And here's the thing, our kids are ready for this kind of work. So in 2015, incoming college freshmen were surveyed, and 8.5% of them said that there was a very good chance they would participate in a protest sometime during their college career. And that might not seem very impressive, but consider the fact that it's the largest number of students to say that since 1967. And 75% of those kids said that helping other people who were having difficulty was a very important or essential goal for them. Again, the highest number of people to say that since the late 1960s. And research shows us that working for justice doesn't just follow from building all those skills I talked about earlier, it actually goes the other way too. So working for justice, engaging in activism, helps students build skills like leadership and critical thinking, and it correlates positively with their political participation and their civic engagement and their commitment to their communities later in life. So in other words, students are telling us that social justice matters to them. And researchers are telling us that it helps students learn. So now it's up to us to listen. And that might not be easy. In 1976, one of those kids who participated in Soweto in the uprising, he said that that event represented divorce between Black children and their families, because their families had grown up under apartheid and they knew how dangerous it was to speak out. They wanted their kids to lay low and stay safe. And when our kids threatened to walk out, a lot of the adults in our community were really conflicted too. Some of us worried that they might encounter violence. Other people worried that they would walk out, but they wouldn't really know why they were protesting. And some, including some students' families, were really angry that the school hadn't done more to prevent them from leaving. And all of those fears that adults have about getting this stuff wrong, all of those fears make total sense. But despite those fears, we've got to prove to our students that we will listen to their voices and that they do have the power to affect change. It's our responsibility to equip our students with the tools and the skills that they need to insist on a more equitable world. And then sometimes to get out of their way and let them apply those skills to things that they care about. Living up to that vision is going to require that we are flexible, and it's going to require that we're creative. It's going to require that we're brave enough to stand up in the face of people who try to silence or delegitimize dissenting voices. And hardest of all, it's going to require accepting the fact that sometimes we will be the ones our students will rebel against. Sometimes they're going to point out ways in which systems that we have created or in which we are complicit contribute to inequity. It's going to be uncomfortable and it's going to be painful as they push us to question our own assumptions and beliefs. But what if we change the way we think about rebellion in our kids? When our kids rebel, when they thoughtfully push back against our ideas or the way that we do things, what if we chose to see that as a sign that we're doing something right and that they're becoming liberated? I know it would be easier if their critical thinking skills manifested in more convenient ways. On their essays or their standardized tests, I get it. But convenience and justice do not often go hand in hand. And when our kids learn to think critically about the world around them, they become the kinds of engaged citizens who will recognize and question injustice when they see it and work to do something about it. Welcoming rebellion into our schools is going to require some rethinking about what teaching and learning look like. Because there's this misconception that if we give students any wiggle room, they're going to walk all over us, and classrooms and dinner tables will devolve into total chaos. And if we expect kids to sit silently and passively receive knowledge from us, then their voices will always feel overwhelming. But if we accept instead that learning is sometimes messy, that it requires opportunities to brainstorm and mess up and try again, that our kids dislike chaos and want to learn when they come to school, then we can set up schools to facilitate that kind of learning. So do me a favor and close your eyes for a second and imagine schools where teachers are thought partners, letting students grapple with complex, hard issues and not necessarily giving them the right answers. And imagine schools where we let students make choices. We trust them enough to do that. And we let them experience the consequences of those choices. Imagine schools where we let students be humans with all of the messiness and the uncertainty that is bound to come with that. Whatever you just imagined, it's not mythical, it's not unrealistically idealistic, because teachers all over the country are already pushing the boundaries of what teaching and learning can look like with amazing results for kids. They're doing that in all kinds of schools, and there are countless models for teachers who want to get better at helping students learn in a way that's more authentic and engaging and empowering. I was reading a book recently. It's called The Students Are Watching. And it was by Ted and Nancy Sizer. And in that book, they said that the work of education is often described as a series of nouns, like respect, honesty, integrity. And they say those nouns sound really impressive, but often they fail to actually mean anything in practice. But verbs, they say, are active. no less demanding, but requiring constant engagement. Verbs are not structures, but rather engines. And so as I read that, I wondered, how do we make justice into an engine driving our work as teachers? What's the verb form of justice? I think there might be an answer to be found in the words of Cornel West, who famously said that justice is what love looks like in public. And all of my nerdy English teachers in the crowd know that love can be a noun and a verb. School has to be bigger. It has to mean more than I teach my subject. School has to be about teaching people to change the world for the better. If we believe that, then teaching will always be a political act. We can't be afraid of our students' power. Their power will help them make tomorrow better. But before they can do that, we have to give them chances to practice today. And that practice should start in our schools. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so very much for being patient through that video and hearing, listening, and also participating in the chat. There were some remarkable comments that I just want to spend some time sharing with the rest of the online community. So Austin said, where are you, Austin? Here you are. Empowered, much of social justice work requires people to think with empathy and compassion. It requires educators and teachers to see students as humans as opposed to just simply students. Absolutely. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how how our efforts to invest in our children will dramatically change the outcomes of the way that children engage with those efforts. Boris said, I like learning is sometimes messy. Jared said we have to apply abolition politics to education. Schools are operating more and more like prisons instead of places for nurturing growth and autonomy. Absolutely. So I am a national consultant on the school to prison pipeline, and I talk a lot about the epidemic that we currently face as it relates to how we have prioritized incarceration over education. So what can we do to go back to the tenets of seeing our children, investing in our children? And I'll talk about some of the models that we have had in the past that we should really look to potentially reframe and adapt the model today. I mentioned that I'll be providing all of the sources that I've used to present that, create this presentation, so you will have access to this. Mylin stated, imagine schools that are not centered around the history and knowledge of Eurocentric ideas and stories. Karen shared, it's interesting because this is used by the way students were taught. If you look at ancient Greece and other cultures, the students would often just sit around the professor, magi leader, and discuss higher levels of ideas and issues. Not sure when we got away from that. And then Rhonda, you struck a chord and I just about started crying when your comment said, oh, and there it is. By the way, I do not apologize when I get teary-eyed. This work is hard and my heart is fully in it. So I invite you to shed a tear if the content inspires that. But Rhonda shared, no justice, no peace. And then she says, no justice, no peace. So to have the knowledge of what justice is and to have the knowledge of what peace feels like. Imagine schools where counselors and deans work out of compassion and love. Yes, thank you, Boris. Again, part of my work on the pipeline epidemic is really bringing to highlight the fact that our counselors are understaffed. There was a study that was done. For every one counselor, there is 778 students that are assigned to them, and that's on average across the nation. So again, there's a lot of things that could be done to more specifically address how trauma and intersections of poverty and intersections of oppression and systemic institutional historical violence has to be taken into account the way that we're showing up in spaces for our children. So there again are such incredible comments that are coming out. So thank you. Thank you for participating. I also wanted to ask you, yes, no, unsure. Can this apply to rape prevention education programming? Feel free to write in the chat. Oh, and Mo also mentioned, make sure we have counselors who match the identities of our children, of our babies, of our students, so that oppression is understood as trauma. Absolutely, Mo, thank you. Okay, we're getting a lot of yeses. We're getting a lot of yeses. David says, this video also brought up the memory of radical movements to bring liberation to the Black community. Memories of the Black Panthers Party, American Indian movement that fight for radical liberation of their people, of all oppressed people. Knowledge of these groups, their organizations, and planning would be extremely beneficial. Absolutely, and we usually do dive into it, David, during my full day session. Today, I'll just briefly touch on it, but you'll see how we do that here in just a moment. So again, most definitely, thank you, Veronica, for the enthusiasm. David, mahalo, thank you. All right, so with that, I wanna also bring to light that as we're talking about social justice, it's important for us to recognize that even within our movement, we have very different definitions of what social justice is. An article focused on defining this term stated that the meaning of social justice is far-reaching and ambiguous. Translation into concrete practice is fraught with challenges. Social justice is contextually bound and historically driven concept. So depending on who you're asking, they'll define social justice differently. So in order to guide us in our conversation today, I want to ground us in common language that we can use. So social justice is going to be defined, and let me close this out. Social justice will be defined today as a tool, a framework, a concept of value, a heart posture, and a lifestyle. Social justice resists against the promotion of any practice or policy that exploits, extracts, degrades, dehumanizes, that justifies violence, and that supports the entitled belief that one can wield power at the expense of others. Social justice generally embraces values such as the equal worth of all human beings, their equal right to meet their basic needs, which requires equitable accessibility to opportunities and resources, the requirement that we reduce and eliminate unjustified societally imposed inequalities. It requires a collaborative spirit towards reform. It's rooted in principles of equity versus equality. It's grounded in the empowerment and liberation of the oppressed and silenced. And social justice is intersectional, culturally conscious, and aware of the historical power imbalances that keep one group dominant over others. So my invitation to all of you is, as you are going back into your spaces and into your coalitions and your organizations, I really would invite you all to think through with your teams, especially your prevention educator teams, if you're diving into this work, to define social justice, to make sure that it is embodied in your mission and in your vision in terms of what the work is at your organization, because language matters. And the way that I perceive justice and the way you perceive justice may be different based on the cultural context of where we have come from and our lived experiences. So again, we have to create shared and common foundation so that we're operating from the same space and being able to work towards the same goal. All right, so that's going to lead us into the next section, which will ask us to consider the need for intersectional efforts. Now, I want to provide another gentle warning that this next portion is a compilation of images, of content that will ask us to think about why intersections matter and consider what intersections have to do with our movement to eradicate and eliminate sexual abuse. But the images, as I mentioned, can be difficult, so please pause and consider your capacity to engage. Now, before I begin, I will just ask that you take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. So let's breathe in, breathe out. And we will do this once again once we conclude. I will not speak through this portion. It will just be a visual opportunity for us to consume a narrative that is being shared through these images. And with that, we will begin. So with that, sorry, one more slide. I'll ask you to consider, what did you see? What did you think? What did you feel? Why do intersections matter? And what does this have to do with sexual violence prevention? Okay. Okay. So let's use the chat option to consider what you saw, what you thought, what you felt. Why do you think that intersections matter? And what does this have to do with sexual violence prevention? And David had already started to touch on it with his comment about looking at the different movements throughout our time. But again, I just want to invite conversation here. Caitlin says, if we eradicate oppression as a whole, then all the types of oppression that are being protested in these photos will be eradicated as well. When oppression as a whole, then all lives will matter. But until that happens right now, all lives don't matter. Okay, we also have all humans From Angie, all humans have a right to be heard, seen, valued. We all want and need love. If we approach each other in this manner, then imagine the freedom of honesty and vulnerability we could see and the opportunities for connection. Paula shares pain and yet hope. Exactly. I see that as well, Paula. Thank you. Amazing people working for change across intersections and time. Yes. Lana, these pictures are deep and meaningful, and absolutely intersectionality is so supremely important. One thing that I notice is generally seen as missing from these conversations is systemic ableism. Yes, Lana, thank you so much. And we'll talk about that momentarily. Oppression is the common denominator. Beverly, thank you. Too often, let's see, we have Libby said, powerful systemic bias against women historically continues, and we must see each other as equal. Mosey said, too often to claim something like Black Lives Matter says to people, well, what about me? What about you? Black Lives Matters because it is clear from our society's actions that we don't. Okay, so I did notice that there was some conversation going back and forth about Black lives and all lives. I think that we as prevention educators have to get comfortable with the discomfort of what this conversation may bring about. But as it relates to the conversation of this workshop and social justice as a prevention framework, I will definitely state boldly that we have to acknowledge that anti-Black racism is at the root of much of the harm we have seen in the nation's legacy of oppression. And we have to be able to recognize that when we see the disparity and we see the lack and we see the inequities, unless we start to acknowledge the root and where most of it started and some of it branched out and developed into the claiming and the stealing and the theft of indigenous lands, all of that is interconnected. I did see that certain individuals mentioned that when we say all lives matter, it discounts what we're focusing on. Many of you have seen the cartoon or the analogy that is shared about the houses burning. Black houses are burning right now. Black houses have been hurting and burning for the last 100 years, and many of them aren't even owned because of redlining and issues of lack of equitable access to banking options. So we have to be cautious of standing in a position in opposition with each other right now, because this conversation requires us to really do the deep work that allows for others to be heard and people to have a safe space in this dialogue. So it is hard. As I mentioned in the beginning, it is critical for us to be willing to confront these spaces, because unless we confront race and racism, we will never be able to achieve justice. So I don't have, unfortunately, enough time to dive into this. I teach a whole class on this, but for right now, I just wanted to make sure that I address this, okay? So thank you once again for your participation in that activity. I want to really talk about how when we are seeing the intersections, it wasn't really until recently that we have seen a shift where prevention education is challenging us to move beyond the individual interventions that we noticed in the ecological model, where we were focusing on just talking about healthy relationships and consent and building capacity for individuals to disrupt sexual violence or interrupt and intervene as active bystanders. But we have to move beyond the individual interventions to community and societal level changes, because what was happening is that as many times as we would have the classes where we would talk to our kids about, we have to respect our partners and we have to make sure we seek consent, and we have to ensure that we are interrupting, disrupting, and engaging in efforts that eradicate sexual violence. Our youth and our students would go back into a world that promoted, perpetuated, and justified sexual violence. So the knowledge that they were consuming when they were in your classes, in our classes, and in our prevention education sessions was in complete opposition to what they were seeing and they were exponentially exposed to. So we are now moving to a space where we recognize community and societal levels have to be taken into consideration, because in order to prevent sexual violence, we must design and implement programming that considers the complex interplay of factors that support and contribute to the success of sexual violence, none of which can be understood in isolation from the others. A social justice framework allows us to draw on the legacies and strategies of grassroots movements for racial justice, reproductive rights, and economic justice to articulate a new vision for change that returns the focus to collectively naming and deconstructing the interlocking power dynamics that are at the roots of rape culture and that contribute to the ongoing scourge of sexual violence. So during this presentation, I really want us to also recognize that there was actually I wanted to share, there was a presentation that I saw from Prevention Through Liberation, and they shared that the Civil Rights Movement, Americans with Disabilities Act movement, Title IX, and more recently, Water is Life and Black Lives Matter, trans and non-binary activism, and the Dreamers have all contributed immensely to the prevention of sexual and relationship violence. Because every group that gets a bit more free regains resilience against sexual, domestic, and other forms of harm, and people in those groups become less likely to enact violence on one another. Our role as rape prevention educators then is not only to teach about consent and healthy relationships, but it's also to help create young agents of change that truly believe that violence, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, racial violence, systemic violence, internalized violence, violence as a whole is connected. That they, these young minds, these young leaders that we have an opportunity to engage with, that they have the power to shift behaviors by standing up against the injustice of oppression that is interconnected and further informed by the context of their own lived experience. We can inspire them to personally commit to not tolerate discrimination, to not tolerate the harm that we see, whether blatant or covert. This will also promote and encourage youth to embrace foundational principles that are rooted in MLK's teaching that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects all indirectly. In addition, social justice will allow us to build critical consciousness. Now, this is something that usually children don't get an opportunity to do. Many of us didn't get the opportunity to do until we came into professional spaces, or our first time we were in college or in higher education spaces, or as we started to do our own work and research. So I wanted to share that there was a great article that I read from Phi Delta Kappan, it's the professional journal for educators, that notes that research suggests that critical consciousness, which is the ability to recognize and analyze systems of inequality, and the commitment to take action against these systems, can be a gateway to motivation and achievement for systematically marginalized students. Researchers have also suggested that critical consciousness of oppressive social forces can replace the feelings of isolation and self-blame that many of our children at times experience for their own challenges with a sense of engagement in a broader collective struggle for social justice. In addition, research has found that a critical consciousness about racism specifically can motivate Black students to resist oppressive forces through persisting in school and achieving in academics. This motivation is often fueled by a desire to prove wrong the stereotypes embedded in racist structures and institutions. So as educators, we must take seriously the question of how to give Black, Brown, Indigenous, and LGBTQIA+ students the language and skills that they need to understand the social conditions that are working against them. Through providing a framework and a language for analysis, making space to talk about inequity, and teaching students how to take action, prevention education programs can integrate youth's socio-political realities into their ongoing work and contribute to their critical consciousness development, okay? So again, I know that this is a lot of content. We might be going at a pretty fast pace, and so I wanna, again, just pause and acknowledge that this work should be, and I know we should never use the shoulds, but the way that I do this work and the way that I'm inviting the government in my state. So I have been asked by the governor of the state of Utah to work in partnership with an exceptional leader in our community, Kim Cordova, to put together a training experience for the cabinet level leaders on racial equity. And at the very beginning and at the root of everything that we do, it's with grace and it's with compassion and it's with empathy and it's with a willingness to share space, even in the face of disagreement. And that's what we are having to cultivate with our students, so that they know that regardless of whether we agree or disagree with them, they are allowed to explore the nuances of what they're feeling and what they're witnessing and what they're sensing in terms of their own identity, so that they can resist internalized racism and the internalized hate that many of our babies are dealing with, okay? So again, I just want to encourage us to always root that as our practice in social justice, but also in our prevention education. In addition, critical consciousness leads and inspires civic engagement, which we desperately need if we ever wish to see a society where equity and justice has been achieved. According to the Ford Foundation, many communities, people of color, women, immigrants, people with disabilities, youth, and the LGBTQIA+ community have been denied equal voice and access to fully participate in democracy at all levels. As a result, their voices are too often silenced in conversations about government, from its spending to policy making. The Ford Foundation also talks about how the country's institutions and policies need reimagining. By centering historically marginalized people in reform efforts, we can realize a truly inclusive civic culture that represents the will of all people. By increasing opportunities for diverse communities to lead and participate in civic affairs, we have an opportunity to achieve a more just society. So among our priorities must be to develop the next generation of civic leaders to not only sustain this work, but to advance the work forward. So I want us now to transition to a practical portion of our training that considers how these principles have been adopted in past initiatives, which can inspire our work as well as current programming that can encourage us to adapt similar models. And I want to begin by providing a brief overview of the Freedom Schools of the 1960s. Now, Freedom Schools were originally part of a nationwide effort during the Civil Rights Movement to organize African Americans and Black children in Black communities to achieve social, political, and economic equality in the United States. The most prominent example of Freedom Schools was in Mississippi during the summer of 1964. And Charles Cobb was a Howard University student at the time who proposed the Freedom School Project in December of 1963. And the purpose, he said, is to create an educational experience for students which will make it possible for them to challenge the myths of our society, to perceive more clearly its realities, and to find alternatives, ultimately new directions for action. The purpose was to try to end political displacement of African American Black children and students, encouraging students to become active citizens and to socially become involved within their community. Freedom School teachers would educate across generations to become social agents of change that would participate in the ongoing civil rights movement. Now, fast forward to 56 years, and Freedom Schools are still helping build up our children from marginalized communities to believe in the power of their education and their ability to contribute in their community as invested members. And the education at Freedom Schools was student-centered and culturally relevant. Curriculum and instruction was based on the needs of the students. It was discussion rather than lecturing, which was encouraged. And the instruction was based on the experiences of their students. So the Children's Defense Fund now operates a nationwide Modern Freedom School program. And this program is coordinated through the Children's Defense Fund's Black Community Crusade for Children initiative. When I talk a little bit towards the end about connecting with non-traditional partners, I would encourage you to look into your community to see if this is currently available, because this might be a way, a phenomenal way to partner with your rape prevention education as well as social justice infused curriculum. The CDF Freedom Schools National Program operates over 130 summer program sites in 24 states across the country, serving nearly 12,000 children. And their curriculum is incredibly robust. During 6 weeks, they teach children and they teach their youth that they can make a difference. Week 1 is in their self. Week 2 is with their family. Week 3 is focusing on their community. Week 4 is that they can make a difference in their country. Week 5 in their world. And week 6 with hope, education, and action. So the key program components are high quality curriculum, intergenerational leadership development, parent and family involvement, civic engagement and social action, and nutrition, health, and mental health, right? So a holistic approach to a child, really understanding that they are so much more than just one child navigating a world, but that they are a leader with the potential to impact, to see themselves represented in a world that maybe at times has erased them, but that we can help them see themselves once again incorporated. Now, I do want to take a moment to look at programs that have incorporated tenets of social justice and civic engagement in their current efforts. I'll use one of the examples that's supported by the CDC and also share a few others, including events that are being hosted in Utah. So one of the strategies provided in the technical package is gender-based education that focuses on empowering and supporting girls and women through education, employment, and income supports, and providing other opportunities for leadership and civic participation, which is incredibly important for reducing women and girls' risks for sexual violence. Programs that build confidence, knowledge, and leadership skills in young women can lead to a greater outcome in education, employment, and community engagement, including political participation. And one of the examples that is highlighted is Powerful Voices Because Strong Girls Become Strong Women, which is hosted in Seattle, Washington. And it provides opportunities for adolescent girls to develop individual leadership skills while also seeking to address root issues for gender inequity through social justice. Such programming ideally will also involve girls as leaders in planning, development, and implementation, and that's what this program does. Effective programs also support family involvement and provide opportunities for girls to connect with their cultural and community identities. So Powerful Voices offers several programs, including Powerful Choices, which is the middle school curriculum for girls, Girl Justice Training, Girl Evolution Conference, which the girls actually put together. They plan it, they find the speakers, they seek the participants, and they are the ones who lead out on this initiative. Community coalitions led by girls, and the Youth Employment Program for adolescent girls to build their marketability and job readiness. So evaluations show that after participating in the program, the majority of girls had increased connection to their cultural identity and values, increased their ability to develop healthy relationships with peers and adults, and received performance evaluations indicating good or excellent job skills, and had also increased their motivation to excel at school. Now, this is an example of an initiative that is held in Utah. So it's called Girls Lobby. Girls Lobby enables high school aged young women to lobby during the legislative session. Now, I do understand that with some of us in prevention education, we have to be careful and cautious. But again, this might be where having those non-traditional partnerships could be an extension of our initiatives so that our youth go through our program and then are able to transition into this next chapter. So participants track and discuss a bill, call and write their legislators, pen editorials, testify at hearings, and speak at press conferences. This connects high school young women to local civic engagement pipelines, and girls will work directly with a local nonprofit, learn about local voter engagement and campaign efforts, as well as build a strong network of powerful women. I do notice that we are running quickly out of time, so I want to be mindful that we do still have 15 slides. So the next one I want to talk about is democracy prep. Some of you may, oh, sorry, Judy, thank you so much. I'll slow down with this section. So some of you might be familiar with Democracy Prep. It is a public school based out of Harlem, and Democracy Prep provides scholars with opportunities each year to travel to their local city halls, state capitals, and Washington, D.C. And all of it is done free of charge to the children. Because when we think about school field trips, or we think about the different opportunities, to travel abroad, those are usually opportunities only allowed for children from middle to upper class families and households. And that again reduces the likelihood that children from low income households and from historically systematically marginalized populations are able to see themselves reflected in these spaces. So through Democracy Prep, they make sure that they provide the opportunity to all children to lobby elected officials on issues ranging from charter school funding to the DREAM Act. Democracy Prep scholars have registered thousands of New York City residents to vote and conducted Get Out the Vote campaigns for local and national elections. Something else I want to note about this school is that it's not just about getting people in their community, but it also starts in the home. So usually when children come in, it's about 8% of the parents that are registered to vote. Their goal is always about 75 to 80%, which they meet. So they are actively making sure that the parents that are part of this school are also taking part in the process. Democracy Prep scholars, including some as young as 9 years old, have even testified before Congress. The next example, or the next event that I want to talk a little bit about, is an example that came out of the division at the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs that I oversee in the state of Utah. And this was a partnership with the NAACP chapter in Utah, in Ogden. It was also a partnership with Weber State University and Project Success Coalition. And it was a 3-part series where we essentially created a platform where Black students could come and talk about their Black experience and how to navigate what it meant to live in this day and time, and to also talk about real life in the midst of the civil rights movement that we are currently engaging and experiencing. And then also strategies beyond the protest. How do we build capacity of our civic leaders so that they have strategies to help them do this work and know how to explore that with people who have come before us and who have opened the doors for civic engagement. So we just wrapped up our series last night, or I'm sorry, on Monday. And so if you're interested in watching those videos, they are available on our website as well as our YouTube channel. And that was a widely successful event, again, because we were allowing for this space to be led by emerging leaders. Another thing that we've done is we've partnered with Comcast, so one of our corporate partners, and we are hosting a 3-part social justice speaker series that focuses on building capacity for larger society to be able to engage in social justice and equity work. So our first event will be tomorrow, September 3rd. That's why I wanted to make sure I provided the information during our presentation today. Spots are still available. We would welcome people from across the nation to join. I'd be more than happy to provide the information, but you can also visit us on Facebook. But this again will be an opportunity to hear from Austin Channing Brown, who talks about how to be an ally and anti-racist. And then you'll hear from experts in our community through a panel discussion and Q&A. So really just to kind of bring us full circle with the idea of how do we build civically engaged leaders, and what do we need to do to ensure that our children know that there is a place for them in this movement. Because of them we can. And I'm not sure if you know who this image is supposed to be reminiscent of, or it's a symbolic one, but it's Dorothy Pittman Hughes and Gloria Steinem. And what we see is that we have leaders from our past who have been able to inspire the work we are doing today. But can I just say that our children can also inspire us, our students, our youth, our young adults can also bring us to a space of humility to understand that there is ways to do this that maybe we haven't thought of. So how do we create that space and share that space? So what we can do is, again, think about our programming in working for justice by incorporating critical thinking. ensuring that we are building the leadership capacity of our students, that we are incorporating the conversations for political participation and the need for civic engagement. And again, that we are helping them build a love for their communities so that there is a commitment to engage with their communities so that they eventually don't just leave, but that they stay and they rebuild. This is, unfortunately, it's not the best image, but I want you to know that there is a framework that exists that has been revised by Hong and Harris and Linder in 2017 that talks about the traditional and social justice paradigms for sexual violence prevention. And traditional paradigms oftentimes would say, would root this in, does not acknowledge the salience of identity, power, and privilege in human interactions. But when we transition into social justice paradigms, the intersections of identity, power, and privilege are essential to understanding and deconstructing interpersonal dynamics. The single story is challenged, and understandings of violence are complex and informed by many counter narratives. So again, we help build their ability to live in a world that is diverse, that is rich with difference, that is beautifully complex, and that it is interconnected. So key recommendations that I would like to make for you all who are taking notes or considering how we do this. Implement trainings framed in social justice. Incorporate anti-oppression and civic engagement principles into your programming. There's an entire section that unfortunately I just had to cut out where I unpack what is anti-oppression, because even that can look very differently for many of us. And we have to be able to make sure that we share a platform and a foundation so that we're doing the work together in solidarity and unified. Also include activities that empower the unlikely leaders, focus on building empathy, compassion, and acceptance of self and others. Include family interventions for a holistic approach so that when we think about economic justice and trying to break the chains of intergenerational poverty, so that if ever a young person is in a relationship that is abusive or unhealthy, they have the financial freedom to be able to get up and leave, right? Like those are the things that we want to be able to help. The amount of times that I have sat with my clients, I was a juvenile defender before I became the director of the state division. And the times that I would hear from my clients or even the parents, that they wish they could have left the abusive homes. They wish that they hadn't witnessed the abuse or that their children hadn't watched the father strike them or the mother hit them, but that they didn't have the financial freedom to do so. We're looking to break not just the patterns of sexual abuse, but the patterns of oppressions that keep people from finding freedom. Approach prevention with a polythic lens that celebrates unique qualities and creates inclusive spaces. Build collaborative, non-traditional partnerships, as I mentioned, what we're doing right now with Comcast, with juvenile justice services, with faith-based organizations, with racial justice organizations like the NAACP. Think through the different partners that have not been strategically and intentionally at the table historically, but who do we need to speak to today? Build collaborative, non-traditional partnerships. I said that, sorry. Build programs rooted in hope and with a vision for change. So at this point, we only have a few minutes, but I would ask that Tori share a video. This is from Ernie. He is a local Utah artist, and the song is called Hold On, and it's featuring the Drisdom family. Let me just see if
Are you seeing the screen?
I am not yet. Joe, you say I'm confused about the schedules. Is there a second part of the session later this afternoon? No, unfortunately, I only have an hour and a half. And so if you ever want to bring me out to your community for a full day session, I am available. So we are doing an overview of social justice principles. So thank you, Austin. I appreciate the kindness. I really appreciate that. So go ahead, Tori, if you'd like to show that video, and then I'll provide closing remarks.
And can folks see my screen?
What I'll do is I'll stop sharing just so that maybe that might be easiest. Okay.
What have we come to? Where is the love? We need direction from God above. Just wanna quit, throw in the towel. What is the use in going the extra mile? Bernie. Yeah, this one is for that lady sitting home alone, contemplating life if she should live it or be gone. This one is for that boy who think he getting grown. He make his own decisions cause he ran away from home. This one is for that mama crying on the phone, trying to mend relations cause addiction had her soul. It's a long road to get where we belong, but the journey makes us strong and trouble never lasts too long. It's what we come to. Yeah, I've been looking for the love. Devil trying to hold me up, I got my foot up on his neck while I look to God above. I know that in this battle I've already won. In these times of great despair, look to the one and cash or care. I know it's hard, but just hold on, my brother. Even you, my sister. Got me dealing with some closure. First quarter, Kobe left us. He's supposed to be a closer. Whole world upside down, fighting battles with Corona. Seems to be premature, but maybe it's the real exposure. Put in perspective, everybody got their motive, but only pure intentions make it sit right with your soul. We was made with hearts of gold. Along the way, we crossed that road, trying to find our way back home. This chaos got us in the hole. That's what we come to. Yeah. I've been searching for the love. Build faith off of trust. You see one down, you pick them up. I remember how that was. I found the strength to overcome. There's so many times in my life when I felt so all alone, and so many times in my life when I felt all hope was gone. But in all those times in my life, He walked with me every step of the way. So when you get there in your life, keep the faith. Things are gonna change. You wake up in the morning, it's a 1:45. Can't go to work, the baby crying and your mortgage is due. Just got a call from your sister, she said granny is gone. You isolated in your room thinking how to go on. But when the trials come against you and it's too much to bear, look to the sky cause He with you, you can cast all your cares. Everything has a purpose, no more living in fear. So stand tall and show the world that you hear. Your changes
Thank you so very much, Tori, for helping facilitate that portion. I wanted to acknowledge we are definitely going through a lot. And I am incredibly grateful for the opportunity to share space with you, whether it's virtual, whether it's only for an hour and a half, but that we could grow together to envision a world where justice and equality and equity, where truth speaking and healing, where reconciliation and reparations, where we can make space to unpack the hard things that will lead us to be able to have the type of community and society where we do achieve the freedom we're seeking for all. And so that video was just a moment of being able to just speak life and hope over the things that right now we are dealing, whether it's personal, professional, or community level. It is difficult and it is hard, but I truly believe that change is coming, and that it will require each and every one of us to take part in a movement where we are lifting it and we are moving this forward. So my final call to action and really my closing remarks, in the words of Cornel West, let us continue to embody what he says justice is, and that is what love looks like in public. So even in moments of tension and strife and disagreement, let us be able to model the type of compassion that says there is enough room. Let's challenge the scarcity mentality that somehow says there is not enough. There is. That is a lie, and there is enough. There is enough room for me to sit with my pain and for you to sit with your truth. There is enough room for you to sit with your anger and for me to sit with my lived narrative. There is enough room. It will take each of us to make a difference for all of us. And I ask that we just continue to self-reflect and consider, what is my role? How do I show up in this space? How can I consider my privilege and my power? How do I consider the bias that I have and that I show up every day with, to really consider how can I be a better ally, a better friend, a better advocate, a better co-conspirator in anti-racism work. Because we cannot all succeed when half of us are held back and half of us are forgotten and half of us are intentionally left behind. So how do we move towards a movement that considers all of us in the way that we think through healing and our prevention efforts? I do just again want to extend that loving reminder that this is a journey, that the end point is nowhere near, and it is constantly requiring us to come back to a space, even when it's hard, even when it's heavy, even when the work feels overwhelming. Give yourself grace, make sure you're practicing self-care, take care of your heart, your mind, your soul, your spirit, your family, your loved ones. Take care of yourself, because we need you in this movement. So please make sure that you are, again, thinking through the things so that you don't burn out, but that you can continue to show up in this space. So give yourself grace for the journey ahead. And act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does. Again, I just want to say in closing that I'm so grateful for every single one of you that participated, that engaged, that stayed focused, that stayed with us. I hope that this provided you with a sufficient foundation to understand the need for social justice as our framework to build civically engaged leaders, and that you feel inspired to address this within your respective communities. I truly believe that by addressing systemic oppression through justice-infused prevention education, it can give all of our children, all of our babies, an opportunity to resist the self-hate and internalized racism that they are taught, and strive for and advocate for a life free of violence and exploitation, so that they have a chance to succeed, to thrive, and to excel, and to believe that they are bold, they are beautiful, and they are brilliant.
Thank you so much, Nubia.
Sorry. I was, you know, like when you start crying and like it catches you. Sorry,
Yeah.
so very quickly, I just wanted to say once again, in order to achieve this, that we really have to reconsider our work to think through the intersections of humanity so that no one is left behind when we seek for and demand justice, healing, and equity. And with that, I will now turn the time back over to you, Tori and Ashley. And again, thank each and every one of you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Nubia. I'm sure you're seeing all of the comments in the chat. Just really appreciating everything that you brought to this session. So I know that we have gone over time a little bit, so I just want to thank you, Nubia. Thank you to our Spanish translators, our ASL interpreters, our closed captioning providers. Thank you to our colleagues at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center for sponsoring this prevention track. Nubia, thank you for everything that you shared. And thank you all for joining us and for engaging in this workshop and conversation. I don't know what's happening to my screen, but final thought, fingers crossed, we do hope to see you next year in 2021 in person, August 4th through the 6th in Anaheim, California, for the National Sexual Assault Conference. Thank you all so much. We hope to see you over the next couple of days here virtually. This will end the workshop for today. Take care and thank you.